Daily Words of God. Job defeats Satan and becomes a true man in the eyes of God. When Job first underwent his trials, he was stripped of all his property and all of his children. But he did not fall down or say anything that was a sin against God as a result. He had overcome the temptations of Satan, and he had overcome his material assets and offspring, and the trial of losing all his worldly possessions, which is to say, he was able to obey God's taking away from him and offer thanks and praise to God because of it. Such was Job's conduct during Satan's first temptation, and such was also Job's testimony during the first trial of God. In the second trial, Satan stretched forth its hand to afflict Job, and although Job experienced pain greater than he had ever felt before, still his testimony was enough to leave people astounded. He used his fortitude, conviction, and obedience to God, as well as his fear of God, to once more defeat Satan, and his conduct and his testimony were once more approved of and favored by God. During this temptation, Job used his actual conduct to proclaim to Satan that the pain of the flesh could not alter his faith and obedience to God, or take away his devotion to God and fear of God. He would not renounce God or give up his own perfection and uprightness because he faced death. Job's determination made a coward of Satan. His faith left Satan timorous and trembling. The force of his life and death battle with Satan bred in Satan a deep hatred and resentment. His perfection and uprightness left Satan with nothing more it could do to him, such that Satan abandoned its attacks on him and gave up its accusations against Job before Jehovah God. This meant that Job had overcome the world. He had overcome the flesh. He had overcome Satan, and he had overcome death. He was completely and utterly a man who belonged to God. During these two trials, Job stood firm in his testimony and actually lived out his perfection and uprightness, and broadened the scope of his living principles of fearing God and shunning evil. Having undergone these two trials, there was born in Job a richer experience, and this experience made him more mature and seasoned. It made him stronger and of greater conviction, and it made him more confident of the rightness and worthiness of the integrity to which he held firm. Jehovah God's trials of Job gave him a deep understanding and sense of God's concern for man, and allowed him to sense the preciousness of God's love, from which point consideration toward and love for God were added in to his fear of God. The trials of Jehovah God not only didn't alienate Job from him, but brought his heart closer to God. When the fleshly pain endured by Job reached its peak, the concern that he felt from Jehovah God gave him no choice but to curse the day of his birth. Such conduct was not long planned, but a natural revelation of the consideration for and love of God from within his heart. It was a natural revelation that came from his consideration for and love of God, which is to say, because he loathed himself, and he was unwilling to and could not stand to torment God. Thus his consideration and love reached the point of selflessness. At this time, Job elevated his long-standing adoration and yearning for God and devotion to God to the level of consideration and loving. At the same time, he also elevated his faith and obedience to God and fear of God to the level of consideration and loving. He did not allow himself to do anything that would cause harm to God. He did not permit himself any conduct that would hurt God, and did not allow himself to bring any sorrow, grief, or even unhappiness upon God for his own reasons. In God's eyes, although Job was still the Job of before, Job's faith, obedience, and fear of God had brought God complete satisfaction and enjoyment. At this time, Job had attained the perfection that God had expected him to attain. He had become someone truly worthy of being called perfect and upright in God's eyes. His righteous deeds allowed him to overcome Satan and to stand fast in his testimony to God. So too did his righteous deeds make him perfect and allow the value of his life to be elevated and transcend more than ever, and make him the first person to no longer be attacked and tempted by Satan. Because Job was righteous, he was accused and tempted by Satan. Because Job was righteous, he was handed over to Satan. And because Job was righteous, he overcame and defeated Satan and stood firm in his testimony. Henceforth, Job became the first man who would never again be handed over to Satan. He truly came before the throne of God and lived in the light, under the blessings of God without the spying or ruination of Satan. He had become a true man in the eyes of God. He had been set free.